Good evening, and thank you for joining us for one of the last events at this year's very special edition of the Malta Book Festival. Are we told what we should read? A very loaded question, and one which we will be touching upon. We'll be touching the tips of many icebergs, I believe, during this event. But thankfully, I believe we have an extremely strong lineup of speakers joining us. Jen Calleja, who will be joining us live from London, from Brixton, London, as we have just learned, who is an author, musician, and literary translator, whose translation from the German into English of Marion Poschmann's The Pine Islands was shortlisted for the Man Booker International Prize in 2019. She is the co-founder also of Prospar Press, together with Katrina Storace, which is a micro-publisher created to support contemporary Maltese literature written in English and in English translation. Professor Jen Callus is a lecturer of literary criticism and theory at the University of Malta's Department of English, and is also a founding co-editor of the journal Countertext, published by the Edinburgh University Press, and focusing on literary and post-literary cultures. Robert Pisani, librarian, musician, and blogger, and most notably at Bobsphere, which is a key reference point for local book lovers, I believe it's safe to say. I'd like to open with a very simple question, which will of course not be a simple question in the end, to all of my speakers here, our speakers. I'd like to ask all of you, perhaps starting with Jen, where do you get your recommendations from these days, your book recommendations? Where do you go to? Who do you go to, and why? Maybe Jen, you could start?
Yeah, hi everyone. It's a really good question. I think word of mouth is a big one. So there's obviously people we always go to, friends and literary colleagues who always have the best kinds of recommendations when you need them. I think social media is a big one. I think there's a real active literary scene on places like Twitter, where there's constant great recommendations being put forward. And there's a few online publications and print publications that I often read the reviews in, and always return to a few reviewers whose opinion I trust. So I think those are where I get my recommendations most.
And Jen, how has this changed over the past few years? Were there different avenues you looked at previously, maybe a few years ago, 5 years ago, 6 years ago?
Yeah, I think that, maybe 7 or 8 or 9 years ago, I really relied quite heavily on traditional reviewing culture. I think I didn't yet know completely what my tastes were and maybe where to get more direct recommendations. So I would go on maybe, say, just the Guardian literary reviews, or even, coming out of university, you're still very much embedded in the canon and the kinds of books that you read when you were studying. So I think my taste was a lot more traditional and a lot more refined by those kinds of institutional recommendations, or the big publishers.
Thank you, Jen. Ivan, Jen just mentioned the institutional recommendations of which you are, and perhaps unwitting representative of tonight. When it comes to your own personal recommendations, however, as somebody who is embedded in the institutions, do you actively seek out alternative sources, or do you find yourself entwined in the institution almost always?
I think a little bit of both. I think there is almost an expectation in my role that I would actually provide recommendations to others about what they might read. In fact, it would probably be considered bad form if I didn't. But I think, I would second what Jen has said. There's a lot of dependence, admittedly, on traditional reviewing. So you will go to the usual sources like reviews on the Broadsheet Press, TLS, London Review of Books, Los Angeles Review of Books, that kind of publication. But you're also picking up quite a lot of chatter, aren't you? From the conference floor, from conversations with writers and colleagues. And I must say it's always very pleasant and delightful to get recommendations from students as well about what to read next. I think I do actively seek some alternative sources for reading because you can, I think, get very aware that you're following a set of mainstream recommendations otherwise. The way in which things have changed over the years is interesting. I think, you know, I'm a great fan of a good browse and a good bookshop. And it used to be possible, say, to walk into Valletta 20 years ago, and there would be something like 6 or 7 bookshops, and you could stop in Zachary Street and Old Bakery Street and so on. There would be a bookshop, and you could be at the shelves over there. And I think I browse in one of the big bookshops in London or Paris or one of the big European cities is always a great source of you know, notes about what to read next.
Yeah, thank you, Ivan. And we'll get back to some of the points you mentioned, but also Robert, who actually used to be who used to work in a bookshop, so there is that angle too. Contrary, perhaps, to the more institutional or commercial hegemonies of book buying and book selling, as a book blogger, like, what is your starting point when receiving recommendations beyond, of course, books being sent your way by publishers and perhaps authors? Where do you seek out book recommendations avenues, and interestingly, how do those influence then your own blogging?
Okay, so the majority of the books that I'm interested in, or I request, would be actually from BookTube, which is the bookish community on YouTube. These have something every month called book hauls, where they receive about maybe 20 up to 20 to 50 books from publishers. They say, okay, now I've got this and I've got this. Then I see which ones interest me, and then I filter them out. Then publishers send online catalogs, and I'll filter those as well. And that will influence the blog. And also, I must admit, I am a kind of a fan of prize lists. That influences a lot. Say the Booker or the Goldsmiths or Gordon Byrne, International Booker, so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we know that you're one of the big chroniclers of the Booker long list and short list, certainly in the Maltese networks. And speaking of prize culture, maybe Jen, perhaps you could help us once again begin this conversation. How would you say that the Booker Prize in particular, but not just the Booker Prize, how would you say that has influenced how taste is formed, how consensus is formed in recent years among book lovers and publishers and writers? What would be your take on this?
Yeah, so obviously the Booker is arguably the largest prize, and since the Booker International changed a few years back to include literary translators also in the prize, that also became even more so a vital prize for, say, the translation community. It kind of made translators, especially with the Booker International, into kind of celebrities in their own right, and kind of gave them recognition that they hadn't previously had. And I think for me personally, it was something that I always followed, you know, definitely prior to being shortlisted last year. I had it written in my diary for years when, say, the Booker Prize and the Booker International Prize was going to be announced. And it was a massive shock when I got longlisted. because it was already in my diary. So I was just looking in my diary and it felt like a prophecy. But what I think is really exciting is, especially with, say, the Booker International, that there are readers who maybe don't read a lot during the year, but then will go out and buy the whole Booker long list or the Booker International long list. And there's something very exciting about that. I think the idea that it becomes a massive literary event and becomes very special and can really guide the way people read. But I think what's happened as well is that having these big monolithic prizes have then bred their own little prizes that are offshoots of these larger ones. So recognizing perhaps that there are certain books that are Booker books or even Booker International books that that there are other prizes necessary to bring in, say, underrepresented genres, different demographics of writer that aren't often recognised. And as I think also a big thing that has come about in the last year is a conversation around how accessible these larger prizes are. So, for instance, for the Booker Prize and the Booker International, if a publisher is longlisted or shortlisted, they have to pay quite a large fee towards the marketing for the prize. So I guess there's two initial sides. There is this excitement of, you know, there being this massive prize which gets a lot of attention for very special books, but then also wondering if it's truly getting all the books that it could do because of, say, financial restrictions.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. And I wanted to ask you a follow-up question on that in relation to the Booker International in particular, also because you yourself happily have experience with it directly, one could say. And when you're speaking about the visibility of certain books and how, you know, recommendations can arise out of that, when we're talking about translation in particular, would you say that the instatement of something like the Booker Prize International, I'm going to make a bit of a stretch here, a bit of a stretch comparison, but for example, when you know, Netflix gets a lot of these subtitled series that suddenly seem to be finding audiences, contrary to perhaps what the previous wisdom is, you know, Scandinoir and The Dark and whatever series, and Casa de Papel, whatever series you want to think of. Would you say, it's a silly comparison in some ways, but would you say there is an equivalent there in terms of having translated fiction at the forefront with the Booker kind of banner? Does it reach a significantly larger audience in that case, from your experience and from your own kind of, you know, analysis as an interested party, let's say?
I guess the comparison is a fair one. I think in a way they can both be linked to different trends, I think, in terms of the way foreign cultures outside of the kind of Anglophone sphere reach those audiences. You know, they're, like you mentioned, things like Scandinoir. There seems to be different trends around different cultures that happen, you know, every year or every decade. It seems like there's a proliferation of translations from certain languages, and that can be kicked off by, say, something like the Booker Prize or the Booker International. You know, after Deborah Smith won for translating The Vegetarian by Han Kang, we've seen a proliferation of Korean literature and translation. And, you know, arguably, I think that's happened, you know, after all these, you know, every prize, I think there becomes a bit more interest, or there should be perhaps, in the kind of wake. But again, it probably depends on the language. But yeah, I think that anything that can highlight translated literature, which in the UK or in the kind of English-speaking world only, I mean, the percentage shifts, but it's something around 5%. Only 5% of literature is translated in our culture, which compared to other countries is kind of minuscule. You're looking at more kind of 30, 40, 50, 60% in other countries in mainland Europe. Yeah. So I think as well, it's with things like Netflix, I suppose it's more about recognizing that by not including a more international, you know, content, more international content, then you're really undervaluing a lot of your market. So I guess it's a kind of different. It's a bit more around kind of the financial side. But I think, you know, being able to watch a program like Dark, which is a German Netflix show, I think it helps to, as it were, normalize, you know, consuming foreign language material. And I think it's also normalizing things like subtitling. I was talking about this other day, you know, dubbed versus subtitling. And on the whole, people seem much more comfortable watching a show and reading the subtitles, which I think is really great. And again, translated literature is becoming more normalized. And it's, you know, it seems strange talking about it in that way, because for me, there's nothing more normal than reading a piece of translated literature, but to other people, it's a huge barrier. There are still people, even very prominent reviewers in the UK, who've openly admitted they don't read translated fiction for some reason. So I think there's still some way to go.
Yes, yes. There's a limit to the Murakamis and Elena Ferrantes, one supposes. Ivan, Jen mentioned something that I'd like to throw at you. The implication, not really an implication, but the assertion that awards like the Booker create almost their own genres and their own aesthetics, and an expectation that a Booker Prize is a certain kind of book. Now, we of course had shifts and changes there, like when obviously the Hilary Mantel moment of historical fiction being gentrified in some ways, when Howard Jacobson won for the Finkler question as a comic novel. But in some ways, those strike me as almost artificial impositions to deliberately change what is clearly perceived, perhaps not as a problem, but as maybe something to address. So, as particularly in your capacity as co-editor of Countertext, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but seems to be very much focused on identifying emerging trends and aesthetic styles. What do you make of not just the Booker, but of how awards shape both the taste, of course, of the audience, but also of the product itself?
It's a good question. I think there is definitely a sense of a culture forming around a literature prize. You just know, for instance, that a book that you might rate personally is probably not quite going to get a nomination to one of the prizes on whom which you would scrutinize. But it's very interesting, I think, to see certain shifts in prizes. And also, I think it's interesting to see certain shifts not taken. So if we think back, for instance, about 17 years, when there was some level of rumor about Jacques Derrida getting the Nobel Prize for Literature, for instance, I think that would probably have produced the same kind of consternation in some circles that Bob Dylan occasioned when he received it. And I think what would have been interesting there is that it would have sealed a certain trend towards the emergence of a blend between criticism and more literary, more lyrical effects in literature. Derrida wrote books like Glas or The Postcard, which have formal invention, lyrical effect, and a quite poetic voice to what that work of critique does. And I think it would probably have legitimized a certain kind of trend in, let's say, writing now, not literature or criticism or one of the terms that is sometimes used, critifiction. In the end, Derrida didn't get the prize. It went to Elfrieda Jelinek. And is that, in a sense, would that have been interesting had it happened? I think it would have been. So I think it's always interesting to see how the judges will how the judging panel will shift their own expectations and the ideas they will have in mind about what to help to give profile to. So, yeah.
No, thank you, Ivan. Now, Robert, Ivan mentioned the judging, and obviously in connection to prizes, but you as a book blogger, as a reviewer, you're somebody who is judging on a much more regular and fast-paced and fast-paced way. What have been, over the past year or so, what have been some of your criteria when it comes to well, judging contemporary fiction?
Okay, what?
And what do you consider? Yes, what do you consider when you look for an?
Okay, what I'm
book?
noticing, so kind of seeing what are trends at the moment. Yeah, okay, at the moment, for the last 3 years, let's say if you take a look at the Pulitzer and the Booker, there's been an emphasis on Black voices, a big one. Not only because of the events that happened this year, but in the last 3, the Booker has become less colonial, let's say more pluralistic. So we're getting authors from Africa, authors from India, Jamaica. This year's Booker, in fact, is quite a multicultural one. And then I'm noticing as well more human aspects. I don't know if that's the right term, but let's say in the past 2 years, motherhood. The amount of books I've been reading about motherhood have been phenomenal, and I don't know if this is a trend or it's mostly about mothers talking about their own mothers or how they're taking care of their children. This year, I mean this month alone, I read 4 books on motherhood. That's just one thing, but I'm noticing even essayists, there's a couple of them, again, they speak about having children and what it's like giving childbirth and being a mother, that is a huge thing I'm noticing. And then there's, I don't want to make this a long list. Autofiction is a big thing, still. Again, for the past 3 years. And then there's what I call playful experimentalism in the vein of Ali Smith. Sophie Ward as well is another one. Olivia Lang. Again, I think the Goldsmiths Prize helped bring that to the forefront, though.
And do you think there is some kind of disconnect or a difference in experience when it comes to considering what the prizes select and what the booktubers or book bloggers get excited about in any given year?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
Oh, definitely. Let's say, in fact, this year a lot of booktubers were very disappointed with this year's shortlist. They've been criticizing it a lot. Generally, most booktubers, even on Instagram, they tend to like more accessible fiction. That's what I don't want to sound, patronizing. Let's say the Costa Awards, they love those types of books they like, or something like, I enjoyed that too as well. Let's say Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine, a book like that. Oh, booktubers adored it, barely any bad criticism. Those types of books they like a lot. So, which are, easy to read, accessible, and yet there's a little bit of, some literary value to them. Okay. Again, not wanting to sound patronizing.
Yes. No, it's a tightrope we'll have to walk when we're talking about, discernment and recommendation and so on. What would you say are you mentioned something already about the distinctions between the social media based book commentary and perhaps the more traditional avenues of reviewing. But what would you say are the largest differences? And do you think blogging is a strange hybrid because it's between traditional media and social media kind of missives or YouTube?
I think blogging actually is more, again, more literary. Let's say, again, I'm in the community of book bloggers as well, and we like the experimental books. We tend to focus on that. We focus a lot on translated fiction, a lot. A lot of bloggers love those. And then they tend to be a bit sniffy over cost of books and etc. Then there's more of a higher literary value. Back when I started blogging in 2010, it wasn't like that. It was quite different.
In what way was it different?
Translated fiction barely made a dent. That's definitely wasn't in there. and more accessible books were praised.
Okay.
Again, also the trend in blogging is to focus more on the small publishers.
Right. Right.
well.
Right. Jen, has this been your experience? Also, somebody who is, active in independent publishing and micro-publishing. What has been your experience of the when you have to branch into getting reviewed or hoping to get reviewed? What has been your experience from your? You can speak from your. You don't have to make any grand statements or analyses. I'm just asking about your experience. What has that been like? What were some of the barriers? Some of the challenges you faced?
Yeah, I mean, I really love being part of the kind of independent publishing scene. So now, obviously, myself as a publisher within it, but as a writer who's had my own kind of poetry and fiction published by smaller presses and essays and also translations. I think it's all about, expectations. So obviously with accepting to go forward with a project with an independent publisher or a small press, the benefits in terms of building a really strong relationship with them and the time that they can put into your work, so working together in the editing process, and just the sheer enthusiasm is kind of unrivaled. The publishers that I've worked with, so Prototype and Rough Trade, and then the smaller presses that have done my translations, like Daft Publishing and Fitzcarraldo when they were starting out right at the beginning. It's beyond a kind of being one little fish in a massive tank. It's like for a long period of time you're their main focus, so you get to have very deep conversations, you build a very strong relationship. But on the other hand, you know that there won't necessarily be a press budget or a very big one. If they're a newer press, they might not have a lot of press contacts, and forming relationships with the press can take a decade. It's something that has to be nurtured, and you need to have those contacts. But for me, when I was starting out as a writer and translator, I think this is why over time I found it really important to have a social media presence. So it's kind of like if it was a small press, plus me not having any kind of outside presence within the literary scene in, say, social media or within contacts, then it would be extremely tricky for a book to get any attention. But I think right at the beginning, I realised, I don't have any literature contacts. I don't come from an arts family. I didn't go to one of the main kind of universities. There was nothing. I was kind of like starting out from scratch. So the kind of alternative from being in a kind of well-connected situation is to form my own connections and form my own kind of presence, and that was through social media. So for me, being a small press author, it means a lot of the promotion, or like a large part of it, can come from me, so having to self-promote and using my connections. But like I say, the enthusiasm and the energy that goes into promoting my book with these small presses is always incredible. And as I'm sure Robert will attest to, there's a really amazing energy in the kind of small press scene, and everyone supports one another. It's not kind of monolithic large publishers who have massive press budgets and publish 20 authors a year. It's everyone, we're all in it together, trying to get these more unusual books out there. And you have smaller publishers promoting each other's books, and you don't always get that with the kind of bigger publishers. So there's a real feeling of camaraderie, I think, within the small press scene.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. I don't know, Robert, if you'd like to.
Yes, social media helped us a lot. If you go on Twitter, it's basically all the heads of small presses. They're all congratulating each other. They're all promoting each other's books. There's a scene, yes, definitely. Just repeating what Jen said.
Yeah. And from your experience, Robert, does the scene really cross national boundaries? Is it primarily Anglophone, or do you see other other voices emerging?
It depends on the press, really. Let's say, example, Fitzcarraldo, they specialize in mostly translated fiction. So and they have a wide variety from it. They've got a Portuguese writer in their ranks that they've translated. They're from other countries. Then there's Charco Press, which is another small one, which only publishes exclusively authors from South America. So yeah, it's giving these. In fact, what they're doing is they're digging up these obscure writers in other countries. If I am understanding,
Yes.
correctly, and pushing them on the Anglophone world.
And what, from what you've observed, what is the reader's impression of this been so far? How are readers reacting to this?
Okay, again, it depends on the social media circle. Again, the bloggers love it. Twitters are into it. Now, BookTube, I mean, there are some small patches of those saying, oh yes, I really like Charco books. I really like books from Blue Moose. But mostly they do stick to the big 5 publishers. Most, not all, but most do. Yeah.
Thanks, Robert.
No problem.
No, and Ivan, again, in terms of your work for Countertext, have you been paying attention to any of these trends, or at least not just from the sort of commercial and economic side, but also in terms of how these new realities, digital realities, and so on, are changing the reading and writing experience? What has been your analysis of this? Have you paid attention to it?
Yeah. About 2 or 3 years ago, we did a special issue on electronic literature. So that's literature that is written, composed specifically to be read on devices, on computers. And there is a particular scene around that field of literature. And what's interesting is to see how much, in a sense of its own area it is, but then how it starts to influence talk and discussions and critique in other areas of literature, both canonical and non-canonical. And we've also published work that is itself experimental, that perhaps might not easily have found a space in a more in one of the larger journals, perhaps. The reason is, I think that as an editorial policy in Countertext, we're always looking to see which new work in both criticism and in fiction and poetry and other genres is trying to push back a little bit against the expectations of what would be done in that genre. And what happens then, of course, is that as a result, you will get writers contacting you, asking about submitting work for consideration in the journal, and also critical work that is seeking to write itself a little bit differently from what might be thought of as the well-made, procedure-led, irreproachable journal article. And it's exciting to see that kind of work come through. It's also a challenge in a sense, because you cannot fall back on the tried and tested protocols for accepting work in these genres. So each text that you're assessing, each text that you're looking at, in a sense, is creating almost the rules for how it's to be read, how it's to be assessed, how it's to be received. So that is certainly interesting. Comes, I guess, with some sense of responsibility and, of course, apprehensiveness that you're doing the right thing about the decisions you're reaching. Yeah.
Yes, because when we're talking about social media and we're talking about all forms of critical consensus, but perhaps social media in particular because it's run by algorithms and consensus machines.
Yes.
I guess a project like yours can be considered to be particularly radical or even transgressive in some ways. Do you view it in that way? And what is your hope for some of the work that you identify and select? Do you think, okay, this work that we've just received is the cutting edge? We hope that in 5 years, 10 years, it will become mainstream or more respected. Is that sort of the line you take?
I think I would probably hesitate to make large claims about anything, because I think there's a lot of value in trying to work through with, I wouldn't even say quiet revolution. I would say an acceptance that I would prefer to think of it in terms of an acceptance of, oh, there can be these other modes in critique, in literary thinking, and then perhaps seeking to see how they can be framed and how they can create their own cultures and communities of discussion. And I think they generally do. What is interesting is we're talking about, in a sense, micro communities of discussion and commentary across so many areas in this discussion this evening, aren't we? And I think that holds even for the work that is done around some academic journals or some press or some magazines like the White Review, for instance, that publishes some really interesting work, I think. What happens is that those communities gravitate around it. They will gradually grow. They will gradually start to affect what is done in other mainstream areas in literary debate and critical debate. But it's almost like there is a simultaneity of multiple readerships now, all congregating around their own groups and communities and so on. And I sometimes wonder whether there is enough interfacing and exchange. So your question is really interesting because I think there are legitimizing procedures and dynamics within each little community. How far that percolates upwards is I think a really interesting question and a complex one. And yeah, it's something we can perhaps discuss further.
Yes, Okay, I'm assuming that's not for us. So it's fragmentation is a big part of what we are all experiencing at the moment through social media and other realities. Jen, I was wondering if you could react to what Ivan just mentioned, in particular about the many different subcultures of literature. I'm wondering if you could give us your own experience of what it's like to, write and review and be reviewed among the particular subcultures you form part of, or if there are many of them, we could even talk about those. I know you mentioned a bit about it earlier, but I was wondering if you could elaborate.
Yeah, I think it's true that there is a kind of grouping, I think, based on genre particularly. So we've spoken a lot about the kind of translated literature scene, and there's a number of actors within that. But then there's obviously the kind of poetry scene here in the UK and the short story scene, and there's kind of a little group for everything. And I think for me, it's interesting as being somebody that traverses maybe multiple groups. So I kind of have many feet in all these different groups. So I get to see the connections in terms of what people seem to be reading, but also the disconnects. So even though we're all part of, say, a wider scene, there are still kind of conversations that aren't really be having across scenes. So for instance, there's you don't really see, say, translated literature being discussed still that much outside of the translated literature bubble. So even though translated literature is being published by some quite prominent publishers, more and more, you still don't see a lot of mixing. And it's the same, I think, between poetry, which is very tight knit and a very very active kind of group, with, say, short fiction writers. So there's I think always going to be this kind of these different clans of kind of writing based on genre, but then they all come together, I think, in reviewing culture. But again, that's another discussion around what gets reviewed most. So, you know, we still know that there's a kind of dirge when it comes to reviewing short fiction collections or poetry, and translated literature is on the up, but it still isn't always, it's not always there. I've started reading all the end of year lists, which have just started to pop up now, proliferate in the Spectator and the TLS. Translated literature, not so much there. Poetry as well doesn't really feature that much. So again, there is a kind of you can notice that there are still genres that are preferred and seem to get the most attention, which I think can then cause tension in the genres that aren't given as much attention. So I find that very interesting, because so you'll know, well, like from my own experience publishing different kinds of works, you know what is more likely to get reviewed. So I think the piece of work that I've produced that's maybe had the most attention in the last year has been a pamphlet essay I wrote called Goblins, which came out of Rough Trade Books. And I don't really know why it got more attention, but I think it's maybe because of the way that it's to do with maybe popular culture, maybe because it's also fictional. It's kind of a bit of, again, you have to kind of throw things out there and see what sticks. And sometimes it's just luck, but other times it can be because of certain trends that are coming in, and different themed poetry collections that might get more attention, or themed short story collections. So it's also that combination between genre and form, but also the subject matter or the content that's getting explored in those books.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jen. And well, Robert, you were cued in there a bit indirectly as a reviewer. What gets your attention, and how do you determine what to review next?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, it's more, well, it's what takes my interest more than anything else. That's so. At the moment, I've got a couple of books for review. I just finished one by a small press, and I gave that prominence because that seemed. I mean, I think that would. I think the plot interests me more. It goes by that. I do sometimes review poetry books, not many, but I have to say, they get to the bottom of the pile. I'm sorry about that. But,
is there any particular reason for that?
No, well, it's not one of my strong points. That's one, and not it scares me, but it's I've been more trained in reviewing prose. Sure. Well, poetry's still a bit of a foreign land for me. Mm-hmm. That's so what when it comes to reviewing, I'll go by plot more or less, and I'll see what takes my interest, and then we start prioritizing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if we can, you cued me in a bit there about the reviewing process itself. Like, how do you go about? Does your writing mainly grow out of the basic impulse to either recommend something or pan something? And how has this developed over the years for you? Like how has the art of recommending books to people or not recommending books to people been refined over the years for you?
Yeah, it has actually. back then when I started, I really didn't like experimental literature. I thought, you know, I want a good solid story. But over the years, you know, small presses has helped us a lot. I've changed my attitude. Now I can see, you know, which ones are really good, you know, what can excite me.
Yeah.
When I'm recommending, it's purely subjective though. It's, okay, I'm really liking this, I have to recommend this, the rest of the world has to read this, you know, that's basically my criteria. As it panning, if it goes, when will I pan? I mean, I don't think I can mention book I didn't like at all, can I? I don't know. There was one book which I absolutely hated, and it's because it gave off mixed messages. That's what I'll say. It was supposed to be to give a voice to a certain type of culture, and in the end, I thought it was completely demeaning it in the long run. And this was a book that got a lot of reviews, and it's been shortlisted for prizes, everything. That's so. But I barely pan a book. I try to see the merits in everything. So it's rare. But like I said, when it goes against my principles, then I'll say, don't read this, it's garbage, you know.
Yeah.
Again, it's subjective, but
Yes. Yeah, but Ivan, I was wondering if you could like contribute to this discussion in the sense that what has been your experience of trying to bridge that subjective experience of a literary work and then placing it in a wider context? Like, this is in some ways a very basic craft question, I suppose, but it's an interesting one, I think, and a perennial one. When it comes to determining, especially something that is new and does not appear to have that many forebears in terms of genre, in terms of literary tradition, and so on, is there a set criteria you follow, or do you adjust according to the work?
I think you're always, to some extent, in the mode of advocacy. So it's going to be incredibly difficult to write about anything you don't like. I don't think anybody is going to want to write dutifully in any of the genres in which any of us here write, simply because I don't think any of us is going to say, okay, we're going to write about this or that because we feel we ought to for some reason. I'm not even sure that we would say, I'll write about this because it's expected, because it's the book of the season or the book of the moment. I think we do want to have some level of engagement and connection with the book. And I think in terms of advocacy, there's going to be a book you will have read of whatever genre that will have struck you in some way, and at some level you're eager to tell the world about it and eager to build a case for it. Now, whether you do it in the voice and idiom of blogging or reviewing or critiquing, I think that connection is going to be there. Jen mentioned something that I was struck by, because she mentioned the pamphlet as a genre, which I think is one of the emerging genres of our time. And she also mentioned the short story. I think we're always puzzled by why short stories aren't more popular, both with readerships and with publishers. There are some glorious exceptions, of course, the work of Borges way back and Alice Munro's work, but you do feel that you'd like short stories to feature more strongly in a number of literary and critical fora. And if I may say so, Jen's own collection, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, is a very interesting book indeed. There's one particular story there that I really like. It's called Literary Quartet.
Oh yeah.
It's
That's the good one. Yeah.
it's biting and it's funny. So yeah, I think that's worth mentioning.
Oh, great. How are we for time? Are you okay for time? Because I'd like to get Robert's take on this. Why is the short story not so frequently covered?
Well, in fact, it's slowly. I think it's gaining though traction because there's every year there's this compendium, and it's called the Best British Short Stories. It's fantastic. But on the whole, I think, well, let's say this. I like short stories, but what I don't like about them is that the quality varies. So you can have a collection, and you'll get 5 amazing short stories, then 2 rubbish ones, and then 3 middling ones. And as a reviewer, and it's something I read with other book reviewers and other bloggers, they all say the same thing. There's some choice bits in this story collection, but on the whole is rather weak.
Yeah.
That's why lots of people like that anthology I was talking about, because the consistency is fantastic from beginning to end. It's good. But there are some indie publishers as well who focus only on short stories, and it's good. They're worth checking out. There's one, it's called Splice. It's almost a short story publisher, and yeah, it's good. Recommended, I can say that.
Great.
Their authors are, the quality is good. But that's why we don't, I can't speak for everyone, but again, from what I've read, it's always mixed reactions.
It's always going to be more challenging to review a book of short stories, because even just the simple act of writing a review and deciding what to include and not to include,
Yes.
what to mention, how to mention it, how to speak about something,
In
I guess
fact,
that's a challenge as well.
yeah, in fact, there's always the fear of being boring when you're reviewing a short story collection, because you can't say, oh, and this one's very good, and then this one's very good, and this one's very good, and then
Get into the list mode, kind of.
Exactly, but then if you only mention 3 that you liked, you're not giving. You're not being, I think, true to yourself.
Yeah.
I think a really good short story collection will have all the themes emerging as you read each story. So it's like a puzzle. That's what a good one, though. And then that makes it easier to review. It's happened. It's happened quite a few times.
I suppose maybe to go back to your kind of open question at the end, Ivan, one of the kind of intuitively you would think that the short story would be popular in a time when the fast-paced consumption of content is becoming the norm. But then again, a short story of 10 pages cannot compete with a YouTube video or Facebook video of 10 seconds. So maybe that is part of...
No, although there is a trend, of course, for flash fiction, as the term goes, which is intensely interesting, I think. Not as easy as it looks, of course, because that level of condensed narration, which has to have thematic resonance, formal incisiveness, and also reach for the readership. That's an incredibly tough challenge. And but I think the success of the work of somebody like Lydia Davis, who's a fine exponent of the form. She has a number of short stories that are barely longer than 2 or 3 lines, some not even that. It's always interesting, though, to see what the reaction of some readers is to flash fiction. There is almost a sense of this can't possibly have the heft of a longer text. And I think we're slowly beginning to discover that while that might be an intuitive response, it's not necessarily the correct one. Yeah, there's a lot of reward, I think, in a good, very short story, so to speak.
Yeah, and Jen, I wanted to get your take on this also because something I wanted to ask you earlier as well, actually, but I'd like to fold that into this question now. we're speaking about, what gets reach, what gets social media reach, and how we even adapt our work sometimes to try and, get the most out of that, especially when we don't have a well-funded marketing machine behind us. So I was wondering if I could sort of get your take on, well, first of all, how you yourself navigated the social media minefield, because you mentioned earlier how that was your only option to promote your work, and perhaps maybe still is to this day in some ways. What are some of the main ways in which you approached it, and was the trial and error kind of thing, or did you kind of pare down certain approaches early on?
I think, it's always strange to talk about social media because I think some people find it a bit kind of vulgar, this idea that social media somehow is part of what literary culture is. But for me, it's been a really positive experience. And I think when I was starting out as a writer and a translator, it's just where I found a lot of really useful advice and material that was all for free. You finish your degree, you finish university or college or whatever, and you're not really sure where to begin accessing the different communities that you need to be part of a kind of living literary scene. And it's where you start getting recommendations for articles, or it's where I learned so much about literary translation just from people sharing material and sharing interviews and things like that. And when I was starting out, I think I started, right from the beginning, I've seen social media as kind of like a living CV. So I keep it quite professional on the whole, although sometimes it does kind of slip. But I wanted it to be a place where if I did a project, I could put it there so that people could see what I've been up to right from the beginning, if I put, I've done a reader report for a publisher, or if I've translated a short story, it's where a lot of editors now kind of hang out. So I would get commissions through social media of saying, I saw you did this. Could you do that for me? Or, I saw that you just published a poem here. Can I commission you to do a poem? And it became kind of my portal into my professional life. So it wasn't just kind of a place for like arguing with people, which I don't do at all as a rule. But I think my biggest thing was that I wanted to be genuine. So I don't feel like I have a made up social media personality or a voice. I really, I only recommend things that I genuinely believe in. I try and be genuinely enthusiastic about things. So social media isn't my job. But it's a really integral part of my job. So I think it's a way in for a lot of people. So I know people that aren't on social media sometimes do feel a bit left out because they feel like maybe they're missing out on conversations and they're missing out on opportunities. But I mentor emerging literary translators and some writers, and I'll bring it up and I'll say what I've just said to you, which is I find it really vital as a tool, as a way of feeling connected. And some people will say, I'll never do it because I find it too intimidating. I don't think it's a very healthy place to spend your time. And I completely understand, because it's not for everyone. You can find yourself really falling down an internet hole. So if you have a problem where you procrastinate, which I often do, it's not sometimes the best place to be. But for me, the benefits outweigh the issues, I think.
Yeah, that's a very intuitive and interesting response for all of us. Robert, you mentioned Instagram book reviewers and booktubers, and Jen has mentioned the dangers maybe of social media sometimes, and in terms of book reviewing. How do you see that developing? Like, do you see an evolution of the Instagram book reviewer? Do you see that becoming a much more solid sort of genre of criticism in its own right?
Yes, I'm seeing actually more and more of it. I can't predict, but at the moment I'm noticing more Instagram reviews Basically, it's like a normal review, actually, the way they do it. They take their, a very nice decorative picture of the book, and then they write all their opinions down there in the comment section, and they get tons of likes. So yes, that could be the future. I'm seeing it as a platform for book reviewing, yes. It's called Bookstagram, in fact.
Yes, yes.
Yes. And the dangers, again, actually for me the biggest danger is that you want to have everything. That the glut, there's too much out there. Again, if I look on my mobile, I go through Instagram, I see, I get about 20, 35 books I want, and I go on Twitter, and then I see another 30 books. Then I receive a publisher's catalog, and I want them all. There's too much. It's not a bad thing, but it's that's where it starts. Yeah,
impose that.
Exactly. But yeah, I can see internet, Instagram is the next big thing.
Well, I mean, the fact that there's such a glut does seem to signify that there is a market for all of these books, and we keep hearing, even at this very festival, that people struggle to find, publishers struggle to find readers. So, based on your, admittedly, of course, very subjective view of things, how much of this do you think is hype, and how much of this is actually backed up by publishing numbers and readership?
You see that I can only guess from my experiences as subjective. Yeah, I think there's still a high readership for this. Definitely abroad, I can see, and I can see that from the reactions I get from posts, and if you see BookTube videos saying, "Oh yes, because I read this, and even though it's hyped, I really liked it," and then you get another BookTube video saying, "Oh yes, because this one mentioned it, and he mentioned it in his Instagram as well," and now BookTubers are going, "Follow me on Instagram, follow me on Instagram," so and you get tons of readers and all these likes. I think people are reading and acknowledging. Yes, I think there's always hype and everything, but I think numbers are showing that.
Right. Okay.
It's living up to it.
That's encouraging. Ivan, what is your take on this in terms of your own experience and knowledge of certain past trends? Presumably you've had an idea of how, not to cast you in that role, but you've had an idea of how certain literary trends have emerged and survived or floundered in the past.
Yeah.
Certain trajectories, certain arcs. What is your perception of the scene right now? Also, in your, directly in the trenches of something like countertext. How do you experience these new trends?
Yeah, I think first of all, social media can be big. Certainly even within academic circles. But I think it's also true that there are other channels for communication that will sometimes kick in. Sometimes the emergence of a new, I don't necessarily want to say trend, but the emergence of new circuits of attention, so to speak, around a movement or an author or a school of interpretation. I think it's very often probably not down to, I wouldn't say chance, but it just so happens that there is a book or an essay or a critique that gets picked up, that gets commented, and these things you can't pre-script, so to speak. There are occasions in which a particular literary conference or a particular event at a literary festival just takes place in a way that certain conversations happen, and then other things follow in the wake of that. And there are various examples in literary history of sometimes a correspondence, one letter from a writer to another writer, and that gets certain things flowing, or a meeting between a writer and a publisher. One remembers, for example, the role that Sylvia Beach played in James Joyce's writing career. So, and I think, you know, a lot of that definitely still operates in today's writing circuits and commentary circuits. So social media can amplify this, can supplement it. It's definitely a very interesting dimension to mixes that were always there, and that find, I think, new ways to mediate themselves now. Mm-hmm.
Okay, like I said, we inevitably are touching on the tips of many icebergs with this conversation, and unfortunately we'll have to leave it at those tips for now. But thank you to all my speakers, your speakers, these speakers, for facilitating and enabling this very enriching discussion, which will leave us a lot to think about, and how we consume literature and how we rate it in this uncertain and strange time and future we are experiencing. Thank you all, and remember to check out all of the previous editions, previous events in the book festival on ktip.org.mt, where you will find an archive of all the recorded sessions, and where you will be able to access all the books that were featured as part of these discussions. Thank you once again for tuning in, and have a good evening.